All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Catherine Calzada. I'm Assistant Dean for Research Development here at the College of Arts, Media, and Design. And I'm really happy to welcome you to the Spring 2021 CAMD Research and Creative Ventures series. This is a 4-part series of events, and I encourage you all to visit the event website. Maybe we can put that in the chat for you to check out the upcoming events as well. But today we are kicking off our theme of health, communication, and new technology. And we have 3 terrific groups of presenters to report out on research they have been working on over the past year. So we're going to move through these fairly quickly. We only have an hour. We're planning for each presentation to be about 15 minutes, and we will save questions and answers for the end. That said, if you have a short clarifying question, we welcome you to put that into the chat. And my colleague Angelica Montemayor will be monitoring that as we go through. So I'd like to turn things over now to our first presenter, Psyche Louie, Assistant Professor of Music, and she will be presenting on her project Multimodal Brain Stimulation for Healthy Neurocognitive Aging, which received a Tier 1 award last cycle. Over to you, Psyche.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. So I'm quite excited to report on this project. I think it's only been going on for the past 1.5 years, but in a way, I feel like it's been motivated by everything else that came before in my life up to this point. And so my lab is called the Mind Lab, where MIND stands for Music, Imaging, and Neurodynamics. And I study music and the brain. And of course, we've known for a long time in the field that music is quite effective at stimulating areas in the brain. And it's not just one area in the brain for music, but there are many areas and many networks that are connected within the brain that are together useful for motivating behavior. And these networks can be looked at using functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that's quite effective. So this thing on the bottom left here is a picture of the brain as it is listening to music that you select to listen to by yourself, right? So there's something that's that when you select the music that you want to listen to by yourself, that agency, right, is kind of already empowering your brain to be more engaged compared to when someone forces you to listen to, let's say, elevator music. And from another perspective, right, so this functional MRI tool is very good for looking at multiple areas of the brain being active. But on the other hand, on this on the right here, you can see that we can also quantify brain activity with very good temporal precision and temporal accuracy. So these are milliseconds here, and so you can see how. So this picture is supposed to represent how when you're listening to music, there's bursts of activity that are happening rhythmically in response to and in prediction of the rhythmic content in music. So we all know that music has rhythm, and we've all grooved to musical rhythm. Sometimes it makes us want to dance. Sometimes it could put us to sleep, right? And so these rhythmic content physically within the music can be useful for stimulating the brain. And so I think that that's been what my lab's been motivated to study for a long time. But we've recently turned to look at the later end of the lifespan, specifically people with Alzheimer's and related disorders or dementia-related pathologies. Now, there's a lot of work on dementia-related pathologies, and we've done quite a systematic literature review by now that kind of synthesizes the evidence from different levels of analysis, right? So at the top level, what you're probably familiar with is that if you have Alzheimer's, you have these behavioral changes that include losing your memory and having an ability to focus. And so that's a more behavioral or cognitive level. But then that's supported at the neural systems, brain systems level by groups of neurons not talking to each other as effectively by not being able to synchronize with each other as effectively as they did before. And then at a cellular level, there's also lots of support for cells being less connected to each other or less able to fire synaptically with each other. And then at the molecular level, there's also evidence for these protein deposits, amyloid beta and plaques and tangles, that are inhibiting the cells from functioning normally. So we know quite a lot about what makes dementia and Alzheimer's related diseases. And we also know quite well that this is a property of aging, right? A special kind of aging. And so in 2016, there was some pretty exciting results coming from the MIT Media Lab, where they looked at a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease, and they showed that, look, they can quantify the reduction in brain firing, that's rhythmic activity of brain firing that's reduced in this mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. And then they can actually stimulate that mouse brain using flickering lights that are flickering rhythmically. And so it was as if this rhythmic flickering of lights could restore that deficient brain activity in the mouse model that led to the mice then reducing their unwanted plaques and tangles in their brain, and then the neurons being more effective at talking to each other, and then the mouse being better at running mazes. So it was pretty exciting. Now that's a mouse. So what about humans? So there was a very exciting paper that we came across now 2 years ago, where they looked at 20-year-old young adults, right? So your typical undergrad, and then compared them in working memory behavior with older adults, so usually in their 70s. And they compared them by recording both brain waves and working memory performance, so both behaviorally and using brain measures. And so what they saw at first, and this is not that new, is that while in young adults, there's great synchronization, rhythmic synchronization between different levels of rhythmic brain activity, this synchronization was decreased, right? So while these two brain networks, if you will, are well synchronized with each other, this one is out of sync. And so what they did was they restored that synchronization with the use of brain stimulation. So this is quite literally electrical signals that are put on, using sponges and electrodes onto your head. And they've put them in frontal lobe and temporal lobes. And together, this restored the rhythmic synchronization of the brain activity to the point that these older adults actually recovered their behavior and improved their working memory behavior to the level of young adults. So this is literally reversing aging, right? It's pretty exciting. It doesn't get more exciting than that. So a 70-year-old who normally shows a reduction in memory performance, it turned out that after this stimulation, they showed an increase in accuracy of working memory performance to the level of an older adult. And so this brain stimulation then revived working memory in older adults just by synchronizing the rhythmic circuits of the brain. So we thought that was pretty remarkable, but do you really have to use a battery, or do you really have to use electrical potentials? Isn't music naturally a form of activating brain networks, right? It is a form of motivated behavior in which you can actually seek out sounds to listen to that can then tune your brain. And so our collaborator, Edward Large, has made a neural network model that can do just this, right? It can take musical sound, right, that is in an audio file, and it can detect the beat. This neural network model can just spit out the frequencies of the rhythm, right? And then he's mapped it onto lights so that the lights can now synchronize to rhythm. Now, so this is a bit different from the smart lights that you can get usually, and probably like around Christmas time. The usual other smart lights, if you turn down the volume of the music, they'll become dim, right? But these ones, because they're synchronizing to the rhythm and not to the raw power level of the sound, they can still stay bright. And even if you have a slightly unexpected situation, like a unexpected beat in music, right, which happens all the time, the neural network model is still able to detect the change in beat. And so what we're proposing to do is add this additional layer of gamma frequency, which is normally disrupted and reduced in aging, and especially reduced in Alzheimer's disease. And so we've assembled quite a wonderful team for this. So Art Kramer is my mentor in this Mentor Tier 1 award. And my colleague Victor Zappi, assistant professor of music technology, and then also Edward Large, who is the one who came up with this system, and Ji-Chul Kim, who is the chief science officer in the company that Edward Large started. And then also on the MD side, we have collaborations with a neurologist, Dr. Maya Geddes, who is based at the Brigham Women Hospital. And then at Parker Tichko, who was a postdoc, who is a postdoc in my lab now, and he had trained with Edward Large. And so we also have a group of undergraduates and lab manager and staff in my lab now. So Milena Quincy is my lab manager, and then Grace and Nicole and Ritu are the students who are in the lab doing this, the hard part of the work. So the idea is that we're going to take music and we're going to add the lights to the music, and the lights will automatically be synchronizing with the music. And then we're going to add that gamma blinking layer that is modulated by the automatic synchrony of the musical beats that's already happening in the lights. And so with this music listening and light blinking paradigm, we're going to have some human subjects experience this multimodal, right, audio-visual experience, and that's going to drive your auditory networks and your reward networks, and that's going to motivate behavior and improve cognition on the top side. And then on the other hand, it's the hope is that it would confer some neuroprotective effects by helping the brain synchronization be restored, and thus reduce these plaques and tangles that are in the Alzheimer's brain. So this is our setup. We have a young adult here who has their EEG, their brain waves being recorded, and we have a visual setup where they have to look at the cross, and what these lights are doing are they're mapped to be optimally effective at stimulating your visual cortex. And what these LEDs will be doing as I play the video is you'll see that they are synchronizing with the music. Yeah, I was considering cutting this short, but some of you were actually grooving to it, as it is one of these very groovy songs that it's hard to listen to without wanting to move. So I thought we'd let it groove for a few more seconds. But here, so the plan is to collect these data in both behavior and brain in young adults, and then in older adults, and then in people with Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. And so let's show just the data from just young adults. We've got 24 people so far, and we can see how when people are listening to the music with the gamma lights blinking, you can see how in the gamma band there's more activity compared to the control condition, and where there's no gamma activity. And you can also see how there's increase in gamma band activity as well as the concomitant increase in other bands of activity, which really suggests that this music and light stimulation is effective at getting different brain networks to be synchronized to each other. So this is a very exciting result so far. Now I'm just plotting a working memory task performance, right? So higher is better. And so in young adults, you can already see how with 24 subjects, while the people who got the regular version of the Synchrony product, which is just the lights without the gamma, they don't particularly show any improvement. But with the Synchrony gamma stimulation, you get an increase in performance after music listening. Now, in turning to the older adults, we only have 7 so far, but we're working actively to recruit these, and hopefully as more older adults get vaccinated, they'll be more happy to come in. You can see how there's actually a slight reduction in performance after the normal control condition, but after the gamma stimulation, there's an improvement in performance. So suggesting that that we're really able to improve some aspect of cognition by increasing gamma activity in the brain. And so this is more a mechanistic look at what the brain is actually doing while people are doing this working memory task. So the memory task is they look at one picture and then they have to remember it for a while, and then they get another picture that's either the same or slightly different, and they just have to say whether it's same or different. And so we're recording brain activity this whole time, and it's over a few seconds. And what you can see is that when people were getting the gamma stimulation, they get a burst in brain activity, and especially in the gamma band after music listening, while they were working on remembering the picture that they'd been looking at. And this was not observed in the control condition. So I'm very excited about these data. I think it's the beginning of lots of ways to improve cognition, but also scientifically, I think there's lots of interesting questions to be answered. So we have gotten a NSF STTR grant for this work, and we've been awarded the phase 1, and hopefully we'll be in time for submission to phase 2. We're waiting to hear back from a couple of NIH grants, but I think more generally, what's useful is that we're hoping to kind of capitalize on the multidisciplinary expertise of the colleagues by incorporating sound and lighting design to these and technology to these research in health applications. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Psyche. I hope you can stick around till the end because I'm sure there might be some questions for you. We're going to move right along to our next presentation. We have with us Miso Kim, Assistant Professor of Art and Design at CAMD. She'll be presenting on reducing anxiety among older adults and caregivers in the face of COVID-19 with mental health-focused game-based interventions. And Miso, I will turn it over to you so you can introduce your collaborators who are with you today.
Thank you. Elena, can you share the presentation? So I will present together with Elena today. I will start and we'll pass the ball to Elena. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our talk. Today, we will share the progress of our ongoing research on designing gamified therapy for anxiety disorder. Our team members are Elena, Valeria from School of Nursing, Casper, and myself. So the problem is that COVID-19 disproportionately affects older adults. New and worsening anxiety in older adults and their caregivers may be a result of sheltering in place and social distancing during the pandemic. Meaningful activity and stimulation are known to help distract from the negative impacts of mental illness and has become an important target for intervention. Studies show that games can have promising application prospects in this area. So in this pilot study, the overall goal was to design digital mental health focused games that integrates the essential elements of therapy for improving anxiety outcomes in adults living in the community. Our specific aims are, first, comprehend the need for therapeutic games for use in adults living in the community, And second, identify the essential characteristics of therapeutic games for mitigating anxiety-related disorders according to psychotherapists for use in adults living in the community. And lastly, develop a digital-based suite of games shaped by professional practice that integrate therapeutic characteristics in a variety of common anxiety-provoking contexts. Now I pass the ball to Elena.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Visu. Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Tocholnikova, and I'm a social scientist and a practicing psychotherapist. And I'm very excited to present on our research study. So in terms of our methodology, we used StudyCrafter, an online platform in which users can create, share, and play interactive projects in the form of digital games or gamified experiences. Here we see two images of StudyCrafter, so you get a sense of its aesthetics and its application. So in terms of our methodology, we recruited psychotherapists domestically and abroad for 3 two-hour workshops at 2-week intervals with open creativity from the first to the last workshop, and our recruitment process focused on my social network with my colleagues. So we had 6 participants, 4 women and 3 men. Their range of specialties were everything from cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral therapy to Gestalt therapy and mindfulness practice. We conducted conceptual exploratory workshops led by open-ended questions, which were used to gather information. We held focus groups, and we held design. Our workshops integrated design elements with experts who trained our participants. Our content analysis was led by 3 primary questions, as you see here, focused on the conceptual development of psychotherapists and their ability to translate their in-person practice into a digital format using StudyCrafter. And I will show you an excerpt of one of our digital psychotherapies. Okay. So you should be able to see my screen here. Please let me know if you can't see it. So this is an example from our first prototype. So it's a lady who's reporting feeling anxiety. And then she's given 2 options. And I'll go with the latter option. I'll try to do my best. And again, she's given 2 options: to focus on her feelings or to understand the cause of her anxiety. So I'll go with the former option deliberately to show you something very interesting. So here we see that for those experiencing anxiety, focusing on their anxiety, on the feeling of their anxiety, is actually hugely contraindicated because it amplifies anxiety to the point of panic attack. Here we also see a linguistic kind of hiccup because we had an international participant who was fluent in English but not in writing English. And so here, the person experiencing anxiety is given the opportunity to try again and to empower themselves to get it right. So we're brought through the steps. So this is the correct path. So now I've chosen to, instead of focusing on anxiety, to learn about it, to empower myself. And they're given additional options, and that's how this first prototype goes. They're given options, and some of the options are right, teaching the person experiencing anxiety the right course of action to mitigate or modulate their experience versus the wrong course of action. Okay. And we have many rich examples. So our research, our pilot study generated a plethora of rich qualitative data that we are in the process of analyzing. In brief, aim 1 was met. So all psychotherapists in our study agreed that psychotherapy in its in-person form can be translated into a digital format for high value, high need use in the community. Aim 2 was also met. So our psychotherapists were able to identify essential elements of their psychotherapy and translate them into digital form. And aim 3 was partially met. So our psychotherapists developed a digital-based suite of games, hugely shaped by their professional practice, but very importantly, not completely shaped by their professional practice. So many of our results are in line with human-computer interaction, which show that using StudyCrafter, using a digital platform to curate their therapy actually helped them zoom into every micro step of their psychotherapy and establish its therapeutic value. And for some steps, they established that those were obsolete or unnecessary. And this is fascinating, especially when we consider that one of our psychotherapists had been practicing for 22 years. And for 22 years, he reported being on autopilot. And this was an opportunity for him to zoom into every step and again, determine its utility. And he determined that many of the steps he was using in his psychotherapy were obsolete. So there was a huge shift from our first to our second prototype, which was really exciting to see. There was a transformation in the thinking of our participants. So the first prototype was heavily focused on psychoeducation, which is an essential part of traditional psychotherapy, teaching the patient about their condition, about their experience, and how to manage it. It was heavily scripted along the lines of traditional therapy. First prototypes were narrative and role-playing in nature, and they were influenced by cognitive behavioral therapy, solution-focused therapy, and they tended to be shorter than second prototypes. And here you see a quote from the first prototype. So here are images from the first prototype, and we see the focus on psychoeducation and cognitive behavioral therapy. First prototypes also focused on teaching those suffering from anxiety to manage everyday kinds of experiences, school, work-life balance, making decisions about university, and so on. There was also a huge emphasis on emotional support and normalizing struggle. So in first prototypes, characters provided each other with care, compassion, and a sense that you're in this. With many others, it's a ubiquitous experience with a protocol of how to handle it. And here we see a quote, and there's so much here to unpack, but in brief, we see one of our participants describe how their thinking transitioned from their first to their second prototype. I think the way I was thinking about it was to kind of showcase skills that players could use in the real world. But after this conversation, I'm thinking, okay, how do I get that more immediate relaxation response? And what this participant and every single other one of our participants came to was that talk therapy and a cerebral approach in line with cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses heavily on identifying one's harmful trigger thoughts, is not fully therapeutically effective, that there needs to be an immediate relaxation response that each therapy triggers in the person struggling with anxiety. So second prototypes focused heavily on delivering that instant relaxation response through grounding techniques and sensory exercises. And here we see examples from our second prototype. So the character on the left says, I feel my feet on the floor. So this character is is imagining the sensory experience of her feet touching the floor. And this is an essential part of grounding. So we had many rich preliminary results. And one interesting thing is that while most of our therapies focused on responding to everyday kinds of anxiety-provoking contexts and situations, one of our psychotherapies focused on an emergency situation. And using digital psychotherapy to deliver radical self-awareness of one's condition, including identifying their immediate trigger points. And very, very importantly, it offered the person experiencing anxiety, our player, we haven't tested our pilot study yet with outside players, but hypothetical player, to test out different scenarios in the game that could trigger their anxiety that they were too fearful to do in the real world, and to desensitize themselves to those triggers. So again, most of our therapies focused on daily management of anxiety, and one of our therapies focused on responding to urgency. So one of our participants imagined a character, Maya, who's stuck at a bus stop at night and the bus doesn't arrive and she's close to panic. And he teaches the player techniques to take them down from panic to their default calm state. And then we have a huge plethora of human-computer interaction results. And what our main result I already discussed regarding how the mere use of using a digital format to curate one's therapy helped them radically re-envision their psychotherapy practice. And again, for some of them, they had been practicing for up to 22 years, and many of them had been practicing for over a decade. And how much more time do I have? do I have
probably just like a couple more minutes?
A couple more minutes. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of our psychotherapies focused on intermittent reward systems and helping those experiencing anxiety to keep track of their learning process, to keep track of their progress in mastering their anxiety, both in terms of psychoeducation and in terms of management skills. So we have incredibly rich data, and unfortunately, I don't, and we don't have the time to share it with you. Although hopefully, eventually, we will. But basically, most of our results deal with human-computer interaction and how the dramatic effects and unique environments that a digital psychotherapy can create can offer transformative results. So healing from anxiety-related conditions is hugely dependent on one to being able to shift their consciousness and their perspective. And digital formats allow one to do that very nicely. They can deliver dramatic effects or bring one into an adventure that they can't experience in their normal life. And in terms of distribution, once we are done with our data analysis, we hope to apply to KaiPlay, to their conference, and submit our write-up for publication. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and that's it. But I've really enjoyed presenting on our research. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the two of you. And finally, we'll move along to hear from Associate Professor in Art and Design, Casper Harteveld, who will talk about the exciting work he's doing in emerging technologies for health.
All right, can focusing my screen. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is a slightly different talk because this is not really one project, but this is more a broad scale initiative that I've started with about a year ago from now. And the previous talk is actually part of that. There's going to be another talk later on in the series on COVID-19, where this is also part of. And then I have several initiatives, one that I'll talk about today. But by and large, the initiative that I'm taking is to focus on emerging technologies for health. Now, why am I doing this? Obviously, Boston is rich of all kinds of initiatives and infrastructures for health. I joined Northeastern in 2012. My focus was on serious games, so games used for all kinds of serious purposes. And I was mostly focused on sustainability and resilience. I resisted the temptation to work on health, but since I'm in Boston and there are so many initiatives, it makes sense to also explore this particular area. And what's also interesting with regards to the Boston area is that it doesn't only have a lot of health, but it also has a lot of technology focused around health and biotech. There are a number of incredible institutes that are around here. So Boston is known for combining health and technology. So that's already there. But then there's this really interesting area of emerging technologies. And with emerging technologies, as I'll talk about in a second, I'm talking about games, augmented reality, virtual reality, machine learning, all these kinds of initiatives and directions and that we are seeing happening and that there's a lot of interest in. And not so surprisingly, although there's a lot of space and opportunities to grow and take more initiatives, Boston already is rich in terms of a lot of initiatives that are being taken. So some of you may have heard the news, but during the pandemic, the first FDA-approved game by Akili Interactive was released, which marks a really interesting milestone in terms of thinking about digital medicine. So, instead of medicine as we know it, now we can actually play video games, and that sounds maybe a little silly and strange, but this is where things are heading towards to, and they've proven to be effective and are now even FDA approved. And the company behind it, Akili Interactive, is Boston-based, which marks and showcases that Boston is already becoming the center of these kinds of efforts. And in addition to this, when we're talking about the emerging technologies, there's also, of course, virtual reality. and augmented reality. And it so happens that one of the large people for companies that are making these initiatives is XR Health, and that happens to be based in Brookline. So here we see that there's a lot of interesting initiatives and opportunities in companies that are already exploring this space. And I think for Northeastern, there's a huge opportunity as well to explore this. And we have already faculty that are engaging in this area already. So I already mentioned it. What do I mean by emerging technologies? AI, machine learning, virtual reality, games, augmented reality. And if you think about it, it can enhance and provide all kinds of opportunities. Take this slide, for instance. This slide was produced with the help of PowerPoint design ideas. I didn't really create these icons. The only thing I wrote was what, and I wrote down these terms, and the whole slide was generated. This is the kind of thing that CAMD researchers can do. We can provide support, we can provide initiatives. And for instance, the previous talk about psychotherapists, the idea was then to empower them to create different ways of doing psychotherapy. So instead of doing the traditional old way, we're providing them emerging technologies, in this case, games, and a tool set for them to be able to create that. And that's where I think CAMD can provide a pivotal role in these discussions around emerging technologies, as opposed to computer engineers or people in Buffet, et cetera, et cetera. They all play a role in this, but CAMD has can play a role in this too. And this is what I try to advocate and advance. So specifically, a project that I'm working on and that I'm super excited about, that I share as part of this broad initiative, and that actually started with this. So about a year ago, it's actually about a year ago, Joe Schwab, who's a surgeon at Mass General Hospital, he just called me up and said, "Can I work with you?" and it came a little bit out of nowhere, but he had a really great vision and idea, and we started working together on a bunch of initiatives. And the one that I'm talking about is the one that we are focusing on at the moment. So he's an orthopedic surgeon and an expert in this particular area, and he's working with Hamid Gednia. That's the person on the left. So Joe is the one in the middle. And Hamid is a mechanical engineer. So here we already see some interdisciplinary work. So there's a surgeon, a health expert, there's a mechanical engineer, and then they also introduced MIT in the form of Stephanie Muller, who's a computer engineering professor. And so we already see a whole bunch of different disciplines. And we started working together on a really exciting project on remote rehabilitation using VR and IAT. So what is this about that we're working on and that we're trying to do it? So this is sort of in a nutshell the project that we're trying to put together. So especially with COVID-19, accessibility towards rehabilitation and therapy is very difficult. Again, the previous project provides some opportunities for that too, in the form of gamified therapy. But with gamified therapy, especially if you're doing rehabilitation, it's more about physical activities that you have to take, and sitting behind the screen and playing the kind of games that we saw in the previous presentation isn't really helping there. For mental health and anxiety, which was exactly the purpose as described in the previous presentation, it would be great. But when it comes to physical activity, we may need to do something different. So COVID-19 has issues in terms of accessibility, but beyond COVID-19, even before the whole pandemic happened, accessibility was an issue too. People who are in remote areas, they have difficulty getting access to physical rehabilitation. There's also an issue of physical rehabilitation just being expensive, and you think a VR headset might be expensive and whatnot. But the thing is, a VR headset, if you can actually do some training with that, might be cheaper than actually trying to go every week or even bi-weekly for some people to see a physical therapist. So we were trying to develop a more low-cost and reliable method and more effective method for remote physical rehabilitation, and we're doing this in the form of a device called the IAT. And this IAT device, what it does, it creates conductivity maps. So these are cuffs basically that could be, around your knees, around your ankles, or somewhere else. And what it does, it generates electric fields or conductivity maps that sort of measures in a non-obtrusive way what's happening, with your muscles. So what kind of muscle engagement you have, what kind of contractions you have, and that provides certain information about what you're doing and what might be wrong with your body. And that information therapists can use, but we can also use that to automate training or provide some sort of suggestions. So the mechanical engineers and computer engineers on the team, they're creating very low cost, user-friendly cuffs that you could put around your body. They provide information about how your muscles are engaging and what they're doing. So as it said here on the figure, it looks at how your muscles are engaged, how your muscles are contracted, and that information is provided to doctors, therapists, and whatnot. And that allows for automatically generating certain training exercises, or it allows for analysis or sort of pre-screening that will be more useful for more effective in-person training. Because you can imagine, time, the cost involved for in-person therapy is also quite something. So if you can provide more information upfront, the actual time in person might be used a lot more effective. At least that's what we're going to study. These are all hypotheses that we're hoping to be able to study in the near future. My role in all of this is focused on creating a virtual reality environment to incorporate all these training exercises, and that would interact with the IAT cuff. So based on the IAT cuff, training will be generated, and the question is, how will that look like? We're still working on that, and I'll explain in a little bit what that will be. But our vision on this in general, and here's some more information on how these IAT cuffs look like. So here you see this was actually an exercise that was done, or a test that we've done with an IAT cuff that Hamid created and tested on himself, and which he did actually during the pandemic. So he didn't have any access to any materials. So he used all kinds of materials that he found in his own home. And I think he actually borrowed some clothes from his wife and used that to construct an IAT cuff. But it seemed to work, and he was able to see that under different levels of angles of how he was moving his leg, that he was able to see actually the information reflected in the connectivity maps. So in terms of the VR environment, what we're imagining is, and these are some pictures of existing environment or imagined environments. Some of you may be familiar with the mirror exercise equipment. And so what we're thinking about is creating a virtual reality environment where there is an avatar of yourself who's actually showcasing, what kind of exercises you need to do. And that's based on your own internal data. So you can imagine that the IAT measures, the muscle engagement, muscle contractions. Based on that, it shows, hey, maybe you're actually doing the movement incorrectly. And you have to imagine that a physical therapist is just looking at the outside. Of course, they can feel and touch your muscles to provide some corrections. But in this case, there's really internal information that could provide even more reliable information about what you have to do. And in this case, we are imagining that that's automatically generated and being done. So with the person on the right, you can imagine that that's a sort of a virtual avatar guiding you, or even representing yourself in terms of like what movements you need to make, which is what we're experimenting with. And this part of this experimentation is done with the XN projects here at Northeastern. So some of you may be familiar with this, but there are extracurricular projects that you can do at Northeastern where you engage with a group of students as part of an ongoing project for which they get credit. And at the moment, I'm working with 13 students who come across Northeastern. Some are Bouvet students, some are Corey students, some are COE students, some are KMD students, and we're all working together and meet weekly to create our first prototype, which I'm very excited about. So I don't have anything concrete to show. These are all still ideas, and at the end of the semester, I'm hoping to have our first prototype of our remote VR rehabilitation. But I am also excited to announce that we do also are organizing a talk on Friday from noon to 1 p.m. where the designer of Endeavor RX, the game that I discussed, which was the first FDA approved game, will be invited, and we'll also be talking about that. And aside from that, there are a bunch of other experts also in the area of virtual reality and games. I think Amy Lou, I saw she was on the group of participants. She's also one of the panelists. So I think we'll have a really engaging and interesting discussion on that, and I'm hoping you will join us there too. And so that's it for now.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have a little less than 10 minutes for questions and answers. I will kick us off with one question, and then I'll turn it over to others. You know, all of your projects are so interdisciplinary. It's fantastic to see you working collaboratively across disciplines. Specifically for you, Professor Psyche Louie, I'd love to hear you talk a little about how the sound design and data visualization tools you referenced briefly, how you use those when developing the LED light show, and if you could talk a little more broadly about possible connections you see to these areas, design and data visualization.
Yeah, so it's really a massively interdisciplinary project for sure. So the sound design part, I think it's from our collaborator Ed. I mean, he's been looking at acoustic waveforms and how they can be used to give frequent rhythmic information that can then be extracted using his network algorithms. And then so that's and I think that most natural music, as in music that you encounter on a daily basis, um, is essentially a form of sound design. Right? I mean, it's a specific form of sound design, and I think that the implicit knowledge and decisions that go into the sound design there include things like what harmonies are you going to use, what rhythms are you going to use, when are you, which hi-hat are you going to use, right? And I think that what that neural network model does is take these stimulus features and extract the rhythmicity from it. For the visual design, it's really a newer area for me because I've been thinking about sound for a long time, but for the light controls, it's really a bit new. But I have friends who are really sort of like me. I mean, they are scientists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, but also who work at the intersection of arts, media, and design, and psychology and neuroscience. And so, a good friend of mine, Karen Schloss, she's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she consults on color perception, and on color and design. And so we worked with her a little bit to think about the color schemes that make sense to put together as an optimal form of brain stimulation.
Thank you. So over to the audience, any questions from those of you attending today? Feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, or enter a question into the chat.
Hi, this is Valeria. Thanks, Psych.
No question.
Fabulous work.
Oh, perfect.
I did put the question in the chat, but I'll repeat it here. When you look at I'm going to say the spectrum of Alzheimer's, we do know that it will flow in phases. And I was just curious in terms of what you found in perhaps the mouse models that can actually be replicated in the human population studies in terms of the phase at which this will have optimal advantage or effect.
I think it would work best in early stages. So I think that's why. So one of the reasons for this is that in an early stage, let's say mild cognitive impairment or subjective cognitive decline stage, it becomes noticeable and important for the individual to keep up to use lifestyle factors to kind of try to intervene on their working memory if at all possible. And that's also a stage when it's easier to select your own music to listen to. So I think that that's our kind of first target. But right now we're still at the stage of collecting the randomized control trial data on young adults and on healthy older adults, and with the idea being that, you know, as shown in the brain stimulation paper, even healthy older adults who don't have Alzheimer's disease or related disorders usually test lower in working memory tasks compared to young adult controls. So I think that's also a good place to start. And these are folks who, so for now we've tested folks who you know, have come into studies to our lab or to neighboring labs for studies and on lifestyle intervention. And so I think we would love to expand towards more populations and look at different groups of people with different kinds of related disorders. I think I'm also just going to put this ad here because we are recruiting right now because yeah, it's hard, as you know, especially in pandemic times, to get older adults especially to want to come into your lab. And so we're brainstorming possibilities of actually going to, let's say, a nursing home and testing folks that way. But definitely a wide reach is helpful. So if you know anyone who, you know, lives in the area or maybe is experiencing some cognitive decline, definitely please refer them to us.
Mhm. And I just had a trailer question to that. And I love the fact that you're looking at both young population as well as old population, because the literature from all the autopsies that were done indicates that some of those neurofibrillary tangles actually are set up way before you see the exhibit of signs and symptoms. So the fact that you're looking at it from that perspective is fantastic. The piece that I have that you might want to think about is whether or not those changes that are observed are sustained changes.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think I think it sounds almost too good to be true, right? If you listen to music, like 3 or 4 songs, you're gonna like have working memory changes forever. I mean, it's not going to last forever. So, but then on the flip side, there's not much downside to experiencing that experience whenever you need that boost. And so, yeah, so I think we need to test, you know, push on the boundaries of that effect for sure. Totally agree.
We have a question for Casper in the chat from Amy Lou. For the VR work you are working on, has your team looked into potential side effects such as motion sickness for the rehab participants? We got a lot of questions in this area from our IRB when working with healthy college students for VR projects.
Yeah, so that definitely is of major concern, because like we can't just say, hey, here's emerging technologies, they seem to all work. I mean, there are definitely challenges in working with these new technologies, and motion sickness is definitely one of them. We're still in the early stages of this, so we are including that as a factor, and especially considering what kind of exercises need to be done. We are currently looking at total knee collapse, or I think I say that right. But one of the tricky things with that is actually a lot of the exercises require you to lay on your back, and it provides different challenges. So I'm less worried in this case about motion sickness, but more worried about how we can actually measure their body movements, because we're trying to integrate motion sensor information with the IAT information, and the IAT information will work, but the motion sensing will be very difficult, because usually you have your controls in your hand, but if you're laying on your back, then your legs are moving, which potentially we could add sensors on the legs beyond the IAT, but that's going to be a challenge for us. But no matter what, there's going to be other exercises too, where you don't lay on your back, but you have to do other exercises, and then motion sickness will definitely be an issue.
Okay. I have one final question for those of you who are able to stick around. This one for Professors Miso Kim and Alina Tochilnikova. Just wondering if one or both of you could talk a little bit about the intersection of game design and experience design in your project, and how the broader area of experience design frames and contextualizes the work you're doing.
Sounds great. Yeah, so maybe I can talk a little and then I can also like pass the ball to Elena. Yeah, because I have to run to the next meeting. So this is perfect timing. Thank you. So what we wanted to do was to like bring in this human-centric like experiential side of the participants in the workshop to like see how we can co-design with the psychotherapist to like enhance the game from the perspective of therapeutic games and psychotherapy. So the co-design aspect was wonderful to be able to really see like things from their perspectives, the psychotherapist perspectives, and also indirectly the perspective of the patients as well by collaborating with the psychotherapists. So I think also the rich data set and like findings that Elena presented reveals that like many of our like enhancement for the like a game in the future will also be like a lot about experiential perspectives. Thank you. I will pass the ball to Elena.
Thank you for that, Misu. So digital psychotherapy aims to hugely simulate the experience of in-person therapy, but amplify its elements that make it high value in a medical sense, where, you know, using the digital sphere, we can amplify certain experiences that have been empirically shown to work to mitigate or stop anxiety. And we can amplify those elements quite easily in a digital format. So our design in our pilot study focused on identifying those elements collaterally in a group. So it was me and 6 psychotherapists, and to basically personalize it and individualize it as much as possible. And that element of it was hard. So during our first workshop, we discussed the difficulties of a digital format for psychotherapy. So one therapeutic element of psychotherapy is the human in-person component. So the relationship itself that the patient develops with their therapist, the quality of that relationship is proportional to one's healing trajectory. And that's difficult to translate into a digital format. And so psychotherapists brainstormed a lot around that, and they were able to find clever solutions or consider clever solutions. And eventually, if we test these digital therapies with the public, with IRB approval, we will have a sense of whether our whether our design process was in line with empirical value, and to see if it really works. I'm not sure if that responded to the question or not, but I hope so.
Yeah, the only thing I will add to that, Elena, in terms of our designing, is it almost mirrors what we do from a physiologic perspective. And we do a lot of, we call it telehealth or mHealth, and have some significant responses based on the human experience. And to extrapolate that to the psychological world, I think that there's a little piece that we have to pull in, and that is the factor of their inability to process as well. So actually being able to capture those processing pieces is what was perhaps the most challenging.
All right, well, thank you so much to all the presenters and those of you who were able to join us and stick it through to the end. Do check out our schedule. Angelica put that again in the chat, and we hope that we will see some of you later this week and perhaps in future weeks as well. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.